The neon sign of Murphy's bar flickered against the rain-soaked pavement, casting an intermittent red glow across the narrow alley that separated the establishment from the abandoned warehouse next door. It was the kind of place where questions weren't asked and conversations were kept low. Marcus Thompson pushed through the heavy wooden door, the familiar smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hitting him like a wall. At 28, Marcus had seen his share of rough nights, but tonight felt different. The weight of the envelope in his jacket pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step toward the bar. 3 months of unemployment had finally led him to this moment, a decision that would either solve his financial problems or destroy what remained of his integrity. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who had been serving drinks at Murphy's for over 2 decades, looked up as Marcus approached. His weathered face showed no recognition, despite Marcus having been a semi-regular customer for the past year. That was the unspoken rule at Murphy's. Everyone was a stranger, even if you saw them every week. Marcus ordered a whiskey neat and settled onto a worn bar stool, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The usual crowd was there. Dock workers finishing late shifts, a few construction guys still covered in drywall dust, and the occasional business type who had clearly taken a wrong turn somewhere, but decided to stay for the cheap drinks. In the corner booth, he spotted the man he was supposed to meet, Tony Ricci, a mid-level player in the city's underground gambling scene. The arrangement was simple. Marcus would deliver the envelope containing betting records and insider information about upcoming boxing matches to Tony. In exchange, he would receive $5,000, enough to cover 3 months of rent and maybe get him back on his feet. His friend Danny, who had connections in the gambling world, had set up the meeting. Danny assured him it was a one-time thing, no strings attached, just a favor between friends. What Marcus didn't know was that the woman sitting alone at the end of the bar, nursing a beer and appearing to read a paperback novel, had been watching him since the moment he walked in. Sarah Chun looked like any other working-class woman unwinding after a long day, jeans, simple sweater, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had perfected this appearance over years of undercover work, blending into environments where her actual identity would have made her a target. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been with Special Forces for 8 years, specializing in intelligence gathering and counterterrorism operations. After 2 tours overseas, she had been reassigned to domestic operations, working with a joint task force investigating organized crime's infiltration into legitimate businesses. The boxing world, with its history of corruption and gambling ties, was a natural target for their investigation. For the past 6 months, Sarah had been building a cover identity as Amy Walsh, a waitress at a diner 3 blocks away who occasionally stopped by Murphy's for a drink after her shifts. She had carefully cultivated relationships with several regulars, learning their stories, their connections, and, most importantly, their involvement in various illegal activities. Tonight was supposed to be a routine surveillance operation, monitoring known associates of the Torino crime family who used Murphy's as an informal meeting place. Marcus finished his whiskey and ordered another, his nervousness evident in the way he kept checking his phone and glancing toward Tony's booth. The envelope felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. He had tried to convince himself that what he was doing wasn't really criminal. It was just information about fights, not drugs or weapons. But, deep down, he knew he was crossing a line he had never crossed before. The bar began to fill up as the evening progressed. A group of young men entered, their voices loud and their movements aggressive. They were clearly already intoxicated from drinking elsewhere, and their presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the normally subdued establishment. Pete, the bartender, watched them carefully, his hand moving closer to the baseball bat he kept behind the bar. Among the group was Jake Morrison, a 25-year-old with a reputation for violence and a connection to several illegal gambling operations. Jake had been on Sarah's watch list for months. He was known to work as muscle for loan sharks and had been suspected in several assault cases that never made it to trial due to witness intimidation. Sarah kept her eyes on her book, but her peripheral vision tracked Jake's movement as he and his friends made their way to a table near the pool tables in the back of the bar. She noted the way he carried himself, the bulge under his left arm that suggested a concealed weapon, and the deference shown to him by the others in his group. This was someone accustomed to being in charge through intimidation. Marcus was so focused on his upcoming meeting with Tony that he didn't notice the change in the bar's dynamics. He had decided to wait until the crowd thinned before approaching Tony's booth, not wanting to draw attention to their exchange. It was a reasonable plan, except that crowds at Murphy's rarely thinned before closing time. and the arrival of Jake's group had actually made the place more crowded and more volatile. At 9:30, Marcus finally made his move. He stood up from the bar, the envelope now damp from his nervous sweating, and began walking toward Tony's corner booth. Tony, a thin man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in Murphy's, nodded almost imperceptibly as Marcus approached. The exchange should have been simple. Marcus would sit down, slide the envelope across the table, receive a similar envelope containing his payment, and leave. But, as he reached Tony's table, Jake Morrison chose that exact moment to stumble backward from the pool table, having just missed an easy shot. The collision was inevitable. Jake spun around, his alcohol-clouded eyes immediately hostile. "Watch where you're going, idiot," he snarled, pushing Marcus backward into a nearby table. Marcus, already on edge about the illegal transaction he was about to complete, reacted more aggressively than he normally would have. "Maybe you should watch where you're going," he shot back, steadying himself against the table. The bar went quiet. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume as everyone turned to watch the confrontation. This was the moment when most people would have apologized, bought Jake a drink, or simply walked away. Murphy's had an unspoken rule about avoiding trouble, and everyone knew that Jake Morrison was the kind of trouble that ended with hospital visits. But Marcus was tired. Tired of being unemployed, tired of making compromises, and tired of feeling like life was pushing him around. The envelope in his pocket represented his attempt to take control of his situation, and he wasn't about to let some drunk punk derail that plan. Sarah, still maintaining her cover as Amy the waitress, watched the situation develop with growing concern. She had observed Jake's pattern of behavior on previous visits. He typically escalated minor confrontations into serious violence. Her training told her to maintain her cover at all costs, but her instincts as someone sworn to protect and serve made it difficult to remain passive. Jake stepped closer to Marcus, his friends forming a loose circle around them. "Do you know who I am?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that preceded violence. Marcus looked around the bar, hoping someone would intervene or at least provide support, but the other patrons had suddenly found their drinks extremely interesting. Tony had slipped out of his booth and was heading toward the back exit, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. The envelope containing Marcus's payment disappeared with him. "I don't care who you are," Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "You bumped into me, not the other way around." It was the wrong thing to say. Jake's reputation was built on fear and respect, and being challenged publicly, especially by someone he didn't recognize, was something he couldn't let slide. His right hand moved toward his jacket, and Sarah knew she was about to witness something that would blow her cover, but might save lives. Pete, the bartender, had seen this pattern before. He reached for the phone to call the police, but Jake's friend Tommy was already moving to intercept him. Murphy's Bar had a policy of handling its own problems, which usually meant that by the time any authorities arrived, the situation was already resolved one way or another. The first punch came faster than Marcus expected. Jake's left hook caught him in the ribs, doubling him over and driving the air from his lungs. As Marcus gasped for breath, Jake grabbed a pool cue from the nearby table, raising it above his head like a club. This was the moment when Sarah Chun had to make a choice that would change everything. She could maintain her cover, let Marcus take a beating that might kill him, and preserve months of careful intelligence work. Or she could intervene, potentially saving a life, but destroying her operation and possibly putting herself in danger. The pool cue began its downward arc toward Marcus's head. Sarah moved. Her transition from seated bystander to active participant was so fluid and fast that most people in the bar didn't immediately understand what had happened. One moment she was Amy Walsh, waitress and occasional Murphy's patron, reading her book and minding her own business. The next moment she was intercepting Jake's attack with a precision that spoke of years of training and combat experience. Sarah's right hand caught Jake's wrist as the pool cue descended, stopping at inches from Marcus's skull. Her left hand delivered a strike to Jake's solar plexus that doubled him over, causing him to drop the improvised weapon. To the casual observer, it might have looked like lucky timing and a well-placed punch. To anyone with military or law enforcement training, it was clearly the work of a professional. Jake's friends reacted immediately, but they were dealing with someone whose reflexes had been honed in combat zones where hesitation meant death. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, assessed threats, neutralized the most dangerous first, maintained situational awareness, minimized collateral damage. Tommy, The friend who had been moving toward Pete spun around and charged toward Sarah. She sidestepped his rush, using his momentum against him to send him crashing into the table she had been sitting at moments before. Her books scattered to the floor, pages separating from the binding. A paperback romance novel that was part of her carefully constructed cover identity. The third member of Jake's group, a large man named Vic who worked as a bouncer at several clubs around the city, approached more cautiously. He had seen enough fights to recognize that Sarah wasn't just some lucky bystander who had gotten in a good shot. The way she moved, the way she positioned herself, the calm expression on her face despite being outnumbered, everything about her screamed professional fighter. Marcus, still struggling to breathe from Jake's punch to his ribs, looked up in amazement at the woman who had potentially saved his life. He had noticed her earlier, thinking she was attractive in an understated way, but had dismissed her as just another customer. Now she was standing over Jake Morrison, one of the most feared men in the neighborhood, having dropped him with moves that looked like something out of a martial arts movie. Jake himself was beginning to recover from Sarah's strike, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. Being taken down by a woman in front of his crew and half the bar's clientele was the kind of humiliation that his reputation couldn't survive. He reached inside his jacket, and Sarah saw the glint of metal as he drew a knife. The dynamics of the situation changed instantly. What had been a bar fight was now a potentially deadly encounter. Sarah's training had prepared her for armed adversaries, but her cover identity as a waitress named Amy Walsh had no business knowing how to disarm knife-wielding attackers. Every move she made from this point forward would further compromise her operation. But Marcus was still on the ground, vulnerable and in the line of fire. Other patrons were beginning to panic, with some heading for the exits while others ducked behind tables and the bar. Pete had given up on calling the police and was now focused on protecting himself and his establishment. Jake advanced with the knife held low, the way someone who knew how to use it would carry it. This wasn't his first time with a blade, and Sarah realized she was dealing with someone who was dangerous even when sober and exponentially more unpredictable under the influence of alcohol. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could probably disarm Jake without killing him, but doing so would require techniques that would immediately identify her as someone with advanced military training. Her entire operation, months of careful work building relationships and gathering intelligence, would be blown in seconds. On the other hand, if she didn't act, Marcus would likely die, and possibly others as well. Jake's friends were recovering from their initial shock, and she could see them positioning themselves to cut off her escape routes. The situation was spiraling toward a level of violence that would inevitably attract police attention anyway, which would compromise her mission regardless of what she did. As Jake took another step forward, the knife catching the light from the neon beer signs, Sarah made her decision. Her cover was already blown. Anyone who reviewed security footage or witness statements would know that Amy Walsh, the waitress, had fighting skills that didn't match her supposed background. The only question now was whether she could save lives while minimizing the damage to her operation. The knife thrust came low and fast, aimed at Sarah's abdomen. She deflected it with her left forearm while simultaneously stepping inside Jake's reach, her right elbow driving upward to catch him under the chin. The impact lifted him slightly off his feet and sent him backward into the pool table, where he collapsed in an unconscious heap. The knife clattered across the floor, coming to rest near Marcus's feet. He looked down at it, then up at Sarah, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lucky or taken a self-defense class. This was someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and had chosen instead to use just enough force to neutralize the threat. Vic and Tommy were both back on their feet now, but their previous confidence had evaporated. They looked at their unconscious leader, then at Sarah, then at each other. Whatever they had expected when they came to Murphy's tonight, it wasn't this. Sarah knew she had seconds before they decided whether to continue the fight or cut their losses. Her position was tactically sound. She had her back to the wall, clear lines of sight to all potential threats, and access to improvised weapons if needed. But she also knew that every additional second she spent in combat mode made it harder to explain away her actions as those of a lucky civilian. Pete, the bartender, broke the silence. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been breaking up bar fights since before most of the participants were born. "Everybody out. Bars closed." It was the kind of declaration that normally would have been met with protests or arguments. But the unconscious man by the pool table and The woman who had put him there created an atmosphere where nobody wanted to test Pete's patience. Vic and Tommy looked at each other, then at Sarah, clearly calculating whether they could take her together. Sarah met their gaze steadily, her posture relaxed but ready. After a moment that felt much longer than it was, they made their decision. They gathered up Jake, who was beginning to stir, and headed for the door, shooting dark looks over their shoulders but clearly unwilling to escalate further. As the bar emptied, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus and Pete. The three of them stood in the sudden quiet, surrounded by overturned chairs and broken glass, each processing what had just happened in their own way. Marcus was the first to speak. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still shaky from adrenaline and the punch he had taken. Sarah looked at him, realizing that this question would determine how much of her carefully constructed world would come crashing down. She had maintained her cover identity for months, built relationships, gathered crucial intelligence about criminal networks that operated throughout the city. All of that work was now in jeopardy because she had made a split-second decision to save a stranger's life. But, looking at Marcus, seeing the gratitude and confusion in his eyes, she found that she didn't regret her choice. Her mission was important, but it wasn't worth letting an innocent person die for. Pete was watching both of them carefully, his experienced eyes taking in details that most people would miss. He had seen Sarah in his bar dozens of times over the past months, always quiet, always unremarkable, always alone. But the woman who had just taken down Jake Morrison and his crew was anything but unremarkable. "My name is Amy Walsh," Sarah said, sticking to her cover story for now. "I work at the diner down on 5th Street. It wasn't technically a lie. She did work at the diner as part of her cover identity. But it wasn't the whole truth either, and all three of them knew it. Marcus struggled to his feet, wincing as his bruised ribs protested the movement. The envelope that had started this whole confrontation was still in his pocket, now completely forgotten in light of everything that had happened. His meeting with Tony was blown, his $5,000 was gone, and his simple plan to solve his financial problems had turned into something far more complicated. But he was alive, and he owed that to the woman standing in front of him. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "Don't worry about it," Sarah replied. But her mind was already working on damage control. She needed to get out of Murphy's, contact her handler, and figure out how to salvage her operation. Every minute she spent here increased the risk of further exposure. Pete began cleaning up the broken glass, his movements methodical and practiced. He had seen enough violence over the years to know when it was truly finished and when it was just taking a break. Tonight felt like the latter. "You two should probably get going," he said without looking up. "Jake's got friends, and they're not all as reasonable as Vic and Tommy." It was good advice. Sarah knew that Jake Morrison's reputation was built on never letting a slight go unanswered. Being humiliated by a woman in front of witnesses was the kind of thing that would demand retaliation, especially once word spread through the neighborhood. Sarah gathered her things, the damaged paperback novel, her purse, her jacket, and headed toward the door. She had almost reached it when Marcus called after her. "Wait," he said. Can I buy you coffee sometime? To thank you properly?" Sarah paused, her hand on the door handle. In any other circumstances, she might have said yes. Marcus seemed like a decent person who had gotten in over his head, and, under different circumstances, Amy Walsh the waitress might have found him attractive and interesting. But Sarah Chun, Special Forces Lieutenant and undercover operative, couldn't afford personal entanglements that might compromise her mission further. She had already risked too much tonight. "That's sweet," she said, turning back to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I don't think that's a good idea." She left Marcus standing in the wreckage of Murphy's bar, surrounded by broken glass and overturned furniture, wondering who Amy Walsh really was and whether he would ever see her again. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet and reflective under the streetlights. Sarah walked quickly toward her car, her mind already shifting from the immediate crisis to the longer-term implications of what had happened. Her cover wasn't completely blown, but it was damaged. Anyone who had witnessed the fight would remember Amy Walsh as someone who could handle herself in ways that didn't match her supposed background. Word would spread, questions would be asked, and, eventually, someone would start putting pieces together. She reached her car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that perfectly matched her cover identity's supposed financial situation, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see a coded message from her handler asking for a status update. Sarah looked back toward Murphy's bar, where she could see Pete still cleaning up and Marcus still standing by the door, probably trying to process everything that had happened. In saving his life, she might have jeopardized an operation that could potentially save many more lives by taking down a criminal organization that trafficked drugs, weapons, and people throughout the region. But, as she drove away into the night, heading toward a safe house where she would need to explain to her superiors why months of careful work might need to be scrapped, she found herself thinking about the look in Marcus's eyes when he had thanked her. Some things, she reflected, were worth more than mission success. Behind her, Murphy's bar went dark as Pete finished closing up, leaving Marcus alone on the sidewalk with his thoughts, his bruises, and a story that no one would believe. 3 days after the incident at Murphy's bar, Marcus Thompson sat in his small apartment, staring at his laptop screen without really seeing it. The unemployment website was open, displaying job listings that all seemed to require experience he didn't have or skills he couldn't prove. His ribs still ached from Jake Morrison's punch, a constant reminder of how quickly his life had spiraled out of control. The envelope that was supposed to contain his salvation now sat on his kitchen table, unopened since that night. After everything that had happened, meeting with Tony Ricci seemed like the least important thing in the world. But the $5,000 he had been promised would have solved so many problems. And now those problems were still there, waiting for him every morning when he woke up. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Amy Walsh. Not just because she had saved his life, though that was certainly part of it, but because everything about her seemed wrong for someone who was supposed to be just a waitress at a local diner. The way she had moved, the precision of her strikes, the calm expression she had maintained while facing armed opponents. It all suggested training that went far beyond self-defense classes. He had gone to the diner on 5th Street the day after the fight, hoping to find her and properly thank her for what she had done. The manager, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, had confirmed that Amy Walsh worked there but said she hadn't been in for her shifts since Monday. No explanation, no call-in sick, just absent. When Marcus had pressed for more information, the manager had become suspicious and asked why he was looking for her. Now, as he sat in his apartment with unpaid bills scattered across his coffee table and no prospects for employment, Marcus found himself wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of his financial situation had caused him to hallucinate superhuman abilities in a woman who had simply gotten lucky against drunk attackers. But the bruises on his ribs were real, and the memory of that knife coming toward his face was too vivid to dismiss as imagination. Meanwhile, across the city in a nondescript office building that housed a joint federal task force, Lieutenant Sarachin sat across from her commanding officer, Major Robert Hayes, trying to explain how 6 months of undercover work had been compromised in less than 10 minutes. Major Hayes was a career military man who had transitioned to domestic intelligence operations after retiring from active duty. He understood the complexities of undercover work, the split-second decisions that could make or break an operation, and the impossible choices that agents sometimes faced between mission success and human life. But understanding didn't make the situation any less frustrating. The Morrison assault was captured on the bar's security cameras, Major Hayes said, sliding a tablet across the desk toward Sarah. We've reviewed the footage multiple times. Your combat techniques are clearly visible and obviously professional. Anyone with military or law enforcement training who sees this will know that Amy Walsh is not who she claims to be. Sarah watched herself on the security footage, seeing her movements from an external perspective for the first time. Major Hayes was right. Her techniques were textbook special forces, efficient and lethal. She had instinctively fallen back on her training without considering how it would look to observers. Has the footage been distributed? Sarah asked. Not yet. Pete Kowalski, the bar owner, has been cooperative. He understands the sensitive nature of ongoing investigations and has agreed to limit access to the footage. But he can't guarantee that word won't spread about what happened. Morrison has friends throughout the criminal community, and some of them are going to want to know who put him in the hospital. Sarah nodded grimly. Jake Morrison had been treated for a severe concussion and was currently in stable condition, but the manner of his injury had raised questions among his associates. A waitress who could deliver that kind of precise damage wasn't going to remain anonymous for long. What's the status of the Torino investigation? Sarah asked. Major Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression conveying the weight of the decision he was about to make. We're pulling you out. Your cover identity is too compromised to continue the operation safely. We'll reassign another agent to build a new identity and restart the intelligence gathering, but That will take months. It was what Sarah had expected, but it still stung. She had spent half a year building relationships, learning the intricate networks of criminal activity that flowed through establishments like Murphy's Bar, and positioning herself to gather intelligence that could lead to significant arrests. All of that work was now worthless because she had chosen to save a stranger's life. There is one complication, Major Hayes continued. The civilian you rescued, Marcus Thompson. Our background check reveals he was at Murphy's for reasons that weren't entirely innocent. Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. What kind of reasons? Major Hayes opened a file and began reading. Marcus Thompson, 28, recently unemployed from his position as a junior accountant at Meridian Construction. He was carrying an envelope containing betting records and insider information about upcoming boxing matches, apparently planning to sell that information to Anthony Ricci, a known associate of the Torino crime family. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The man she had risked her mission to save had been there to commit a crime that connected directly to the criminal organization she had been investigating. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. So he's one of them? Sarah asked. Not exactly. Our assessment is that he's an amateur, probably desperate for money and making poor choices. His financial records show significant debt and no income for the past 3 months. The betting information appears to have come through a friend with gambling connections, not through any formal relationship with organized crime. Sarah stared at the file, trying to process this new information. Marcus had seemed genuinely scared during the confrontation, not like someone comfortable with criminal activity. But appearances could be deceiving, especially in her line of work. What do you want me to do about him? Major Hayes closed the file and looked directly at Sarah. We want you to make contact with him, not as Amy Walsh, but as yourself. He's already seen you in action, so maintaining the waitress cover is pointless. We need to know exactly what information he was carrying, who provided it, and how deep his connections go into the gambling network we're investigating. It was a logical next step, but Sarah felt uncomfortable with the idea of approaching Marcus under false pretenses again. He had been genuinely grateful for her help, and using that gratitude to gather intelligence felt like a betrayal of the trust that had been established between them. And if he refuses to cooperate, then we'll pursue other options. But our psychological profile suggests he'll be receptive to cooperation, especially if he believes it will help him avoid criminal charges for the attempted information sale. Sarah understood the subtext. Marcus Thompson was now a potential asset in their investigation, whether he realized it or not. Her spontaneous decision to save his life had inadvertently given them access to someone who might have valuable intelligence about the criminal networks they were trying to infiltrate. As Sarah left Major Hayes' office, she found herself thinking about the ethical complexity of her situation. Her job required her to manipulate relationships and exploit human connections in service of larger goals. But the incident at Murphy's had blurred the lines between her professional and personal responses to danger. Marcus Thompson represented everything that was complicated about undercover work. He was simultaneously a victim who deserved protection, a criminal who needed investigation, and an asset who could advance their mission. How she handled their next interaction would determine not just the success of her current assignment, but her own sense of professional integrity. 2 days later, Marcus was leaving his apartment building when he noticed a woman sitting in a coffee shop across the street, watching him through the window. It took him a moment to recognize her without the dim lighting and chaotic atmosphere of Murphy's Bar, but there was no mistaking Amy Walsh's distinctive features. She looked different in daylight, more serious, more alert, as if the casual waitress persona had been replaced by someone with a specific purpose. When she saw that he had noticed her, she stood up and walked out of the coffee shop, crossing the street to approach him. "Hello, Marcus," she said when she reached him. "We need to talk." The directness of her approach confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Amy Walsh was not just a waitress who had gotten lucky in a bar fight. The woman standing in front of him moved with purpose and spoke with authority that came from training and experience. "I've been looking for you," Marcus said. "I went to the diner, but they said you hadn't been to work. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Her training had taught her to read people quickly and accurately, but Marcus seemed genuinely confused and grateful, not like someone who was trying to manipulate her. "My name isn't really Amy Walsh," Sarah said. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chun, United States Army Special Forces. I was working undercover at Murphy's Bar as part of a federal investigation into organized crime activities. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him as he processed this information. A federal investigation. Military special forces. Everything that had happened at Murphy's suddenly took on a different meaning, and he began to understand why Amy, Sarah, had been able to handle herself so effectively against Jake Morrison and his crew. Federal investigation, Marcus repeated slowly. Into what? Into the criminal networks that operate in this area, including gambling operations, money laundering, and other illegal activities. Networks that you were apparently planning to do business with the night we met. The accusation hit Marcus like a slap. Sarah's tone had shifted from neutral to slightly hostile, and he realized that this wasn't a social visit or an opportunity to thank his rescuer. This was an interrogation. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded weak and unconvincing. Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a photograph. It showed Marcus clearly, sitting at the bar in Murphy's, with the envelope visible in his jacket pocket. We have security footage of your meeting with Tony Ricci, as well as records of communications between you and Daniel Kowalski regarding the arrangement. Marcus stared at the photograph, his mind racing. Daniel Kowalski, Danny, was the friend who had set up the meeting with Tony. Marcus had trusted Danny's assurance that it was a simple, one-time transaction with no serious consequences. Now he was beginning to realize how naive that trust had been. I was just trying to solve some financial problems, Marcus said. I lost my job, I'm behind on rent, and Danny said he knew someone who would pay good money for information about upcoming fights. I didn't think it was that serious. Sarah continued watching Marcus's face as he spoke, looking for tells that would indicate deception. His body language suggested genuine distress and confusion rather than calculated lies, which matched the psychological profile her team had developed. What kind of information were you planning to sell? Sarah asked. Marcus hesitated, realizing that anything he said could be used against him in court. But the woman standing in front of him had saved his life, and despite her official capacity, he felt compelled to tell her the truth. Betting information, he admitted. Inside details about which fighters were dealing with injuries, training problems, personal issues that might affect their performance. Danny said it was just insider knowledge, like stock tips. And where did this information come from? My former job. Meridian Construction has contracts with several boxing gyms around the city. I helped manage the accounts, so I was in the gyms regularly, talking to trainers and fighters. You hear things. Sarah nodded, understanding how Marcus had access to valuable gambling intelligence without realizing its true worth or the criminal implications of selling it. Construction companies often had maintenance contracts with various businesses, providing natural cover for gathering information. How much were they going to pay you? $5,000. The amount confirmed that Marcus was dealing with serious players. $5,000 for insider betting information suggested that the people involved were planning to place substantial bets based on his intelligence. This wasn't small-time neighborhood gambling. This was organized crime territory. Marcus, I need you to understand something, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. The people you were planning to do business with are connected to criminal organizations that are responsible for drug trafficking, violence, and other serious crimes. What you thought was a simple transaction was actually you providing intelligence to help fund those activities. Marcus felt sick as the full implications of his planned action became clear. He had been so focused on his immediate financial needs that he hadn't considered where his information would lead or who would ultimately profit from it. I didn't know, he said. Danny told me it was just betting information. He made it sound like fantasy football or something. Your friend Danny has been involved with illegal gambling operations for years. He specifically recruited you because he knew you had access to valuable information through your construction work. The betrayal by Danny hurt almost as much as the realization of how close Marcus had come to becoming involved with organized crime. Someone he had trusted as a friend had manipulated him into a situation that could have destroyed his life. What happens now? Marcus asked. Am I under arrest? Sarah considered her options. Technically, Marcus had committed attempted criminal activity, but he hadn't actually completed the transaction. More importantly, he might have valuable intelligence about how information networks operated within the criminal organizations they were investigating. That depends on whether you're willing to cooperate with our investigation, Sarah said. We need to know more about the information you had access to, how the recruitment process worked, and what other connections Danny might have had with organized crime figures. Marcus understood that he was being offered a choice between cooperation and prosecution. It wasn't really a choice at all. Cooperation was his only realistic option if he wanted to avoid criminal charges and potential retaliation from the people he had failed to deliver information to. What kind of cooperation? Marcus asked. We need you to maintain contact with Danny and others in his network. Find out how they recruit people with access to information, what kind of intelligence they're most interested in, and how the payment and distribution systems work. You would be acting as an informant, helping us understand how these networks operate. The idea of becoming an informant terrified Marcus. He had seen enough movies and television shows to know that informants often ended up in dangerous situations, especially when dealing with organized crime. But the alternative was facing federal charges that could result in prison time and a criminal record that would make finding employment even more difficult. Would I be protected? Marcus asked. We would take precautions to ensure your safety, but I won't lie to you. There are risks involved. These people don't react well when they discover they've been compromised. Marcus thought about his situation. He was unemployed, facing eviction, and had few prospects for legitimate income. His attempted involvement with criminal activities had already put him at risk, whether he cooperated with law enforcement or not. At least working with Sarah offered the possibility of doing something positive with his circumstances. If I help you, what happens to the charges against me? If you provide valuable intelligence and testify when needed, we can arrange for immunity from prosecution related to the attempted information sale. But you would need to commit fully to the cooperation, no half measures, no holding back information. Sarah watched Marcus consider her offer, understanding the difficulty of the decision he was facing. Becoming an informant was dangerous and psychologically challenging, requiring someone to essentially live a double life while gathering intelligence on people who trusted them. But Marcus Thompson was in a unique position to provide access to criminal networks that had been difficult to penetrate through traditional investigative methods. His background in accounting and construction gave him legitimate reasons to be in places where criminal activities occurred, and his financial desperation provided believable motivation for involvement in illegal activities. I need to think about it, Marcus said finally. You have 24 hours, Sarah replied. After that, we proceed with or without your cooperation. As Sarah walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone on the sidewalk outside his apartment building, both of them understood that their relationship had fundamentally changed. What had begun with her saving his life in a bar fight had evolved into a complex web of criminal investigation, federal law enforcement, and personal choices that would define both of their futures. Marcus spent the rest of the day walking around his neighborhood, trying to process everything Sarah had told him and weighing his limited options. The envelope that had started everything was still sitting on his kitchen table, containing information that had seemed like his salvation, but had actually been his introduction to a world he never wanted to enter. By evening, he had made his decision. The next morning, he would call the number Sarah had given him and agree to cooperate with the federal investigation. It wasn't really a choice, it was survival. But, as he lay in bed that night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Sarah's offer would change his life in ways he couldn't predict or control. He had thought his biggest problem was unemployment and financial stress. Now he was about to become an informant in a federal investigation of organized crime, working with a special forces operative who had saved his life and might now be putting it in danger for entirely different reasons. The irony wasn't lost on him. Amy Walsh, the waitress who had rescued him from violence, didn't exist. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the federal agent who wanted to use him as an informant, was real. And Marcus Thompson, unemployed accountant turned reluctant federal informant, was about to discover just how complicated his simple life could become. The coffee shop where Marcus met Sarah the next morning was deliberately chosen for its multiple exits, clear sight lines, and distance from any establishments known to be frequented by criminal associates. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, positioning herself at a corner table where she could observe both the entrance and the street outside. Marcus walked in exactly on time, his nervousness evident in the way he scanned the room before spotting her. He had spent the night going over his decision repeatedly, questioning whether cooperation was his best option or simply his only option. Either way, he was committed now. I'll do it, Marcus said without preamble as he sat down across from her. I'll work with you. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of hesitation or doubt that might indicate future problems. Reluctant informants often changed their minds when the reality of their situation became clear, and she needed to be confident that Marcus understood what he was agreeing to. Before we proceed, I need you to understand exactly what this involves, Sarah said. You'll be maintaining contact with Danny Kowalski and anyone else he introduces you to. You'll be gathering information about their operations, their methods, and their connections. And you'll be doing all of this while they trust you as a friend and business partner. Marcus nodded, though the weight of what she was describing was clearly settling on him. How long would this last? That depends on what kind of intelligence you can develop and how quickly we can build cases against the major players. Months, possibly longer. The timeline was daunting, but Marcus had expected a long-term commitment. Federal investigations weren't resolved quickly, and his usefulness as an informant would depend on his ability to maintain relationships over extended periods. What about my safety? You said there were precautions. Sarah opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. Emergency contact numbers, safe house locations, communication protocols. You'll never be completely without backup, but you need to understand that we can't protect you from every possible threat. Marcus reviewed the documents, noting the complexity of the security arrangements. Multiple phone numbers, coded text messages, scheduled check-ins, escape routes. It was like something from a spy novel, except the consequences of failure would be very real. There's something else you need to know, Sarah continued. Jake Morrison, the man you encountered at Murphy's bar, has been asking questions about what happened that night. He's specifically interested in identifying the woman who put him in the hospital. The revelation sent a chill through Marcus. He had hoped that the incident at Murphy's would fade from memory, but apparently Jake Morrison wasn't the type to let such a humiliation go unanswered. What kind of questions? He's been asking people who were at the bar that night about Amy Walsh, trying to find out more about her background and where she works. He's also been inquiring about you, trying to figure out what brought you to Murphy's in the first place. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Does he know about the meeting with Tony Ricci? We don't think so, but Morrison has connections throughout the criminal community. If he keeps digging, he might discover information that could complicate our investigation. Sarah didn't mention that Jake Morrison's inquiries had actually been helpful to their investigation, providing them with additional intelligence about criminal networks and communication methods. But his interest in Marcus represented a potential threat that needed to be managed carefully. So what do I do if he approaches me? You stick to the story that you were just a customer who got caught in the middle of a bar fight. You don't know anything about Amy Walsh except that she helped you out. You haven't seen her since that night. It was a simple cover story, but Marcus wondered if it would hold up under pressure. Jake Morrison hadn't seemed like someone who accepted simple explanations, especially when his reputation was at stake. Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a standard smartphone but had been modified with additional features. This is a specially configured communication device. It looks and functions like a regular phone, but it has encrypted messaging capabilities and emergency alert systems. Marcus examined the device, noting that it felt slightly heavier than a normal smartphone and had subtle differences in the button configuration. How does it work? Normal phone functions work exactly as you'd expect, but there's a hidden app that allows you to send coded messages to our monitoring team. There's also a panic button disguised as the camera flash. Hold it down for 3 seconds, and it sends an immediate distress signal with your location. The technology was impressive, but Marcus found it unsettling to think that he would need such sophisticated safety measures for what was supposedly just gathering information about gambling operations. When do I start? Contact Danny today. Tell him you're still interested in making money through information sales, but that you want to be more careful about security after what happened at Murphy's. Let him think you're scared, but still motivated by financial necessity. Marcus nodded, understanding the psychology Sarah was describing. Danny would expect him to be nervous after witnessing violence, but greed would overcome caution if the potential profits were sufficient. What kind of information am I looking for? Sarah opened another file, this one containing photographs and profiles of various individuals connected to organized crime activities in the region. These are the primary targets of our investigation. Anyone Danny introduces you to, any meetings you're invited to attend, any operations you learn about. We want to know everything. Marcus studied the photographs, memorizing faces and names. Some of the individuals looked like stereotypical criminals, but others appeared to be ordinary businesspeople or professionals. The diversity of the group reinforced how extensively organized crime had infiltrated legitimate society. The key thing to remember, Sarah continued, is that you're not trying to be a detective or gather evidence for prosecution. You're just trying to understand how these networks operate, who the major players are, and what kinds of activities they're involved in. Leave the analysis to us. It was good advice. Amateur informants often got into trouble by trying to prove their value through overly aggressive intelligence gathering, which typically resulted in blown covers and Dangerous exposure. Sarah spent the next 2 hours walking Marcus through various scenarios he might encounter, communication protocols he needed to follow, and warning signs that might indicate his cover had been compromised. By the time they finished, Marcus felt somewhat more prepared for what he was about to undertake, though he still harbored serious doubts about his ability to successfully deceive people who made their living through manipulation and violence. "Remember," Sarah said as they prepared to leave the coffee shop, "your motivation is money, not justice. You're a desperate man making poor choices because of financial pressure. That's a character these people understand and trust." Marcus walked home with the modified smartphone in his pocket and Sarah's instructions echoing in his mind. His first task was to contact Danny and re-establish their relationship, but he found himself dreading the conversation. Danny had been a friend for years, and the idea of systematically betraying that friendship, even in service of law enforcement, felt deeply uncomfortable. But as Marcus looked around his neighborhood, noting the signs of economic decline, the young men standing on corners with no legitimate employment prospects, the businesses that stayed open despite never seeming to have customers, he began to understand why organized crime had been able to establish such deep roots in the community. Danny answered on the second ring, his voice carrying a note of surprise that suggested he hadn't expected to hear from Marcus after the incident at Murphy's. "Marcus, Jesus, I heard about what happened at Murphy's. Are you okay?" The concern in Danny's voice sounded genuine, which made Marcus's task even more difficult. "I'm fine, just shaken up. That was way more intense than I expected. Jake Morrison's a psycho. Nobody blames you for getting caught up in his shit. But, hey, did you manage to connect with Tony before everything went sideways?" Marcus had rehearsed this part of the conversation. "No, the whole place exploded before I could make the exchange. Lost my chance at the $5,000. There was a pause on Danny's end, and Marcus could almost hear him calculating opportunities. "That's rough, man. But, the information you had was still good. There might be other opportunities to make some money." "I don't know, Danny. That scene at Murphy's was pretty scary. Maybe I should just focus on finding regular employment." "Come on, Marcus. How's that working out for you? You've been looking for a job for 3 months, and you're about to get evicted. Sometimes you have to take risks to change your situation." The pressure Danny was applying matched exactly what Sarah had predicted. Financial desperation was a powerful motivator, and criminal networks were skilled at exploiting economic vulnerability. "What kind of opportunities are we talking about?" Marcus asked, allowing a note of interest to creep into his voice. "Why don't we meet up tomorrow? I can introduce you to some people who are always looking for reliable information sources. Safer environments than Murphy's, more professional operations." Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror as Danny took the bait. The investigation was moving forward, but each step deeper into the criminal network increased his personal risk. "Okay," Marcus said, "but I want to be sure about security. I can't afford to get caught up in another situation like the other night." "Don't worry about that. The people I'm talking about run legitimate businesses on the surface, much more discreet than Tony's crowd." After ending the call, Marcus immediately sent a coded message to Sarah using the modified smartphone. The response came back within minutes, confirmation that they had been monitoring the call and approval to proceed with the meeting. That evening, as Marcus sat in his apartment preparing for his new role as a federal informant, he tried to reconcile the different aspects of his situation. He was about to begin systematically betraying people who trusted him, but those same people were involved in activities that contributed to crime and violence in his community. The moral complexity was overwhelming. Marcus had grown up believing that right and wrong were clearly defined categories, but his current circumstances forced him to operate in shades of gray that challenged his fundamental assumptions about ethics and loyalty. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Heard you had some trouble at Murphy's. Interested in discussing mutual interests. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Central Park coffee cart near the pond." Marcus stared at the message, his blood running cold. The text wasn't from Danny, and it wasn't using any of the communication protocols Sarah had established. Someone else knew about his presence at Murphy's and wanted to meet with him. He immediately sent an emergency message to Sarah, including a screenshot of the text. Her response was immediate and urgent. "Do not respond to that message. Do not go to that meeting. Contact me immediately." Marcus called the emergency number Sarah had provided, and she answered before the second ring. "Where are you right now?" Sarah asked without preamble. "In my apartment. What's going on?" That text message came from someone connected to Jake Morrison's crew. "We think they've identified you as a person of interest and are trying to set up a meeting to question you about what happened at Murphy's. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Less than 24 hours into his cooperation with federal law enforcement, and his cover was already being threatened by the very people who had caused the original confrontation. What do I do? Nothing. Don't respond to the message, don't change your routine, and don't try to contact Danny until we figure out how much they know. We're going to adjust our operational security and possibly accelerate the timeline for your introduction to Danny's contacts. Marcus understood that the investigation had just become significantly more dangerous. Instead of operating from a position of relative anonymity, he was now a known quantity to people who had both the motivation and the capability to hurt him. Are they watching me? We have to assume they are. From now on, you follow the security protocols we discussed exactly as outlined. No deviations, no improvisation, no taking chances. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his darkened apartment, realizing that his life had fundamentally changed in ways he was still trying to comprehend. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been unemployment and unpaid bills. Now he was caught between federal law enforcement and organized crime, with his safety dependent on his ability to successfully deceive dangerous people while gathering intelligence for prosecution. The irony wasn't lost on him that his financial problems, the original motivation for his attempted involvement with criminal activities, were now the least of his concerns. He was about to discover whether his decision to cooperate with Sarah Chun would lead to redemption or destruction. Outside his apartment window, a car with tinted windows had been parked across the street since sunset. The occupants weren't federal agents providing protection. They were Jake Morrison's associates, conducting surveillance and planning their next move in a game that Marcus was only beginning to understand. The bar fight that had seemed like the end of his troubles was actually just the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous situation. And Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who had saved his life once, was about to find out whether she could do so again under circumstances that would test everything both of them thought they knew about survival, loyalty, and the price of justice. The surveillance van parked 2 blocks from Marcus's apartment building looked like any other contractor's vehicle. Faded paint, equipment visible through the rear windows, and company logos that would pass casual inspection. Inside, Sarah Chun and her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez from the Organized Crime Task Force, monitored multiple video feeds and communication channels as they tracked the movements of both Marcus and his potential threats. Target 1 is moving, Rodriguez reported, watching a screen that showed Jake Morrison leaving his apartment building, heading toward downtown, same route he's taken the past 3 days. Sarah adjusted her earpiece and checked the GPS tracker that was monitoring Marcus's modified smartphone. Target 2 is still at home, no movement since yesterday evening. He's following protocols. The past 48 hours had been a delicate balancing act. Marcus was supposed to proceed with his meeting with Danny while avoiding contact with Jake Morrison's crew, but Morrison's people were actively trying to force a confrontation. Sarah's team was working to protect Marcus while maintaining the investigation's momentum, but the situation was becoming increasingly unstable. Movement at Target 2's location, Rodriguez announced, pointing to a different screen that showed Marcus leaving his apartment building through the rear exit. He's using the escape route. Sarah felt a surge of concern. Marcus wasn't supposed to leave his apartment until they gave him the all-clear, which meant either he was improvising, dangerous for an untrained informant, or something had forced him to evacuate. Check his phone, Sarah ordered. Rodriguez pulled up the communication logs from Marcus's modified device. Emergency alert sent 12 minutes ago. Text message, 2 men in lobby asking about me. Using rear exit per protocol. The timing was problematic. Jake Morrison was downtown, but his associates could easily have been sent to Marcus's building while Morrison provided an alibi elsewhere. It suggested a level of coordination and planning that indicated serious intent rather than casual curiosity. Track his movement and activate backup protocols, Sarah said. We need to get him to a safe house before they figure out his escape route. Marcus moved quickly through the alleys behind his apartment building, following the route Sarah had shown him during their security briefing. The modified smartphone in his pocket was providing GPS tracking to her team, but he had no way of knowing whether they were close enough to help if he encountered problems. The rear exit had brought him into a maze of service alleys and loading docks that connected several blocks of older buildings. It was good for avoiding observation, but also provided multiple places where hostile surveillance could be waiting. Marcus tried to remember Sarah's instructions about moving through potentially dangerous areas. Vary your pace. Use reflective surfaces to check for followers, trust your instincts about threats. His phone buzzed with a text message, and Marcus felt his heart rate spike until he saw that it was from Danny. Change of plans. Meet me at the warehouse on Industrial Avenue instead of the coffee shop. More private for introductions. The message created an immediate dilemma. Marcus was supposed to maintain his relationship with Danny to advance the investigation, but changing meeting locations was exactly the kind of security red flag that Sarah had warned him about. Criminal operations often used location changes to test whether someone was working with law enforcement or to set up ambushes. Marcus sent an emergency message to Sarah's team. Danny changed meeting location to Industrial Avenue Warehouse. Proceeding or abort? The response came back quickly. Abort. Too dangerous with current threat level. We'll coordinate alternative contact. But, as Marcus prepared to send a message to Danny canceling the meeting, he spotted two men at the far end of the alley, clearly watching him. They matched the description of Jake Morrison's associates from the intelligence files Sarah had shown him. One of them was speaking into a cell phone, while the other began walking in Marcus's direction. Marcus quickly sent another message to Sarah. Spotted Morrison's people. Maybe trapped. Then, he turned and began walking quickly toward the opposite end of the alley, hoping to reach the street before his observers could coordinate with other team members to surround him. Inside the surveillance van, Sarah was coordinating with multiple units to respond to Marcus's situation while simultaneously trying to understand how Jake Morrison's crew had been able to track his movements so effectively. We've got teams moving to both ends of that alley, Rodriguez reported. But it's going to take at least 5 minutes to get people in position. Sarah studied the tactical display showing Marcus's location relative to known surveillance points and potential escape routes. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Marcus was operating without backup in an environment where his safety depended on decisions he wasn't trained to make. Give me a direct line to his phone, Sarah ordered. When Marcus's phone rang, he almost didn't answer it, thinking it might be another attempt by Morrison's people to manipulate his movements. But the caller ID showed it was from Sarah's secure number. Where are you exactly? Sarah asked immediately. Industrial Alley, about 2 blocks from my building. 2 men watching me from the east end, and I think there are more at the west end. Okay, listen carefully. There's a loading dock about 50 yards ahead of you on the left side. The door should be unlocked. Our people opened it remotely. Go through that building and exit on the other side. We'll have a pickup team waiting. Marcus spotted the loading dock Sarah was describing and quickened his pace. Behind him, he could hear footsteps and voices, suggesting that his observers were no longer content to simply watch. The loading dock door opened easily, and Marcus found himself in a dimly lit warehouse space filled with shipping containers and industrial equipment. Emergency lighting provided just enough visibility to navigate through the maze of stored goods toward what he hoped was an exit on the far side. As he moved through the warehouse, Marcus could hear voices behind him, indicating that his pursuers had followed him into the building. The acoustics of the large space made it difficult to determine exactly how many people were tracking him or how close they were getting. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. Keep moving straight ahead. Exit is approximately 100 feet directly in front of you. Marcus pushed forward, weaving between shipping containers and trying to move as quietly as possible. The voices behind him seemed to be getting closer, and he began to worry that he wouldn't reach the exit before his pursuers caught up with him. That's when he heard the sound of engines starting up outside the building, multiple vehicles arriving simultaneously. For a moment, Marcus thought it might be Sarah's backup team, but then he realized that federal agents wouldn't announce their presence so obviously. Sarah, there are vehicles outside the exit. Multiple engines. I know. Change of plans. There's a service ladder about 20 feet to your right that leads to an office level. Get up there and wait for our signal. Marcus spotted the ladder and climbed quickly to a mezzanine level that overlooked the warehouse floor. From his elevated position, he could see at least 4 men moving through the warehouse below, systematically searching the area where he had been hiding. Meanwhile, outside the building, Jake Morrison himself was coordinating with his team members to ensure that all exits were covered. Morrison had been planning this operation since the night at Murphy's bar, using his network of contacts to identify Marcus and track his movements. Morrison's investigation into the incident at Murphy's had been thorough and professional. He had interviewed witnesses, reviewed security footage, and used his connections throughout the criminal community to gather information about both Marcus and the mysterious woman who had humiliated him. What Morrison had discovered was that Amy Walsh, the supposed waitress, didn't exist in any meaningful way. The employment records at the diner were fabricated, her apartment lease was paid through a shell company, and none of her supposed personal connections could be verified. Everything about her background suggested law enforcement or intelligence agency cover identity. Marcus Thompson, on the other hand, was exactly who he appeared to be, an unemployed accountant with financial problems and connections to people involved in illegal gambling operations. But his presence at Murphy's bar on the same night as a federal agent was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Morrison's working theory was that Marcus was either an informant who had been compromised or an undercover agent himself. Either way, he represented a threat to criminal operations throughout the region, and Morrison intended to neutralize that threat through interrogation and, if necessary, elimination. From his hiding place on the mezzanine level, Marcus watched the search pattern of Morrison's men and realized that they were being systematic and thorough. It was only a matter of time before they discovered his location, and he doubted that Sarah's team would be able to extract him before that happened. His modified smartphone buzzed with a message from Sarah: "Hold position. Tactical team, moving to your location. ETA 3 minutes." 3 minutes felt like an eternity when armed men were actively hunting for you in an enclosed space. Marcus tried to control his breathing and remain as quiet as possible, but every sound from the warehouse floor seemed to indicate that discovery was imminent. Below him, one of Morrison's men was speaking into a radio. "Building is clear on the ground level. Target must be on the upper level or in one of the containers." Marcus realized that his hiding spot wouldn't remain secret much longer. He needed to make a decision about whether to surrender to Morrison's people, try to escape on his own, or trust that Sarah's tactical team would arrive in time to extract him safely. That's when the lights went out. The warehouse plunged into complete darkness as Sarah's team cut power to the building from an external junction box. Emergency lighting provided minimal visibility, but it was enough to disorient Morrison's search team and give Marcus a tactical advantage from his elevated position. "Move now," Sarah's voice commanded through his earpiece. "Straight ahead from your current position. There's a window that leads to an external fire escape. We've got people positioned to cover your exit." Marcus moved carefully through the darkness, using his hands to feel his way along the mezzanine railing toward the window Sarah had described. Behind him, he could hear Morrison's men cursing and trying to coordinate their search without proper lighting. The window was exactly where Sarah had indicated, and it opened easily onto a fire escape that led down to an alley where 2 unmarked vehicles were waiting with engines running. Marcus climbed out of the window and began descending the fire escape as quickly as safety would allow. Halfway down, gunshots erupted from inside the warehouse. Apparently, Morrison's people had decided to shoot at shadows rather than continue searching blind. The shots were followed by shouts and the sound of people moving quickly through the building. Marcus reached the bottom of the fire escape and ran toward the waiting vehicles. The rear door of the closest car opened, and Sarah's voice called out, "Get in." As Marcus dove into the back seat, the vehicle was already accelerating away from the warehouse. Through the rear window, he could see armed figures emerging from the building, but they were too late to prevent his escape. "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked, turning from the front passenger seat to examine Marcus for injuries. "No, just scared," Marcus replied, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the escape. "Good. We need to debrief immediately and figure out how Morrison's people were able to track you so effectively. This wasn't random surveillance. They knew exactly where to find you." As their vehicle merged into traffic and headed toward a safe house, Marcus realized that his role as an informant had just become significantly more complicated and dangerous. Jake Morrison wasn't simply a violent criminal seeking revenge. He was conducting a professional counterintelligence operation that suggested connections to organized crime networks with sophisticated capabilities. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we find out who's leaking information to Morrison and his associates," Sarah replied. "Because someone with access to our operational plans is feeding intelligence to the people we're trying to investigate." The implication was clear. There was a mole within the federal task force, and Marcus's safety depended on identifying that person before Morrison's next attempt to capture him. The bar fight that had started everything was looking more and more like a minor incident compared to the conspiracy that was being revealed. Marcus had thought he was agreeing to help with a straightforward investigation into local gambling operations. Instead, he was caught in the middle of a complex web of corruption that extended into law enforcement itself. And Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who had promised to protect him, was about to discover that some threats came from within her own organization. The safe house was located in a suburban neighborhood that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Two-story colonial homes, well-maintained lawns, and the kind of quiet respectability that made excellent cover for federal operations. Inside, however, the house had been extensively modified with communication equipment, surveillance monitors, and security systems that would have been at home in a military command center. Marcus sat at a conference table in what had once been the home's dining room, still trying to process how quickly his life had spiraled from unemployment problems to federal witness protection. Across from him, Sarah Chun and Major Hayes were reviewing intelligence reports and trying to determine how Jake Morrison's crew had been able to track Marcus so effectively. "The leak has to be someone with access to our operational communications," Major Hayes was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Morrison's people knew exactly where Marcus would be and when he would be there. That's not the result of street-level surveillance. That's intelligence from inside our operation." Sarah nodded grimly, understanding the implications. A compromised federal investigation wasn't just an operational failure. It was a threat to everyone involved in the case, from undercover agents to civilian informants like Marcus. "How many people knew about Marcus's cooperation?" Sarah asked. "Too many," Major Hayes replied. "The information was distributed to task force members, support staff, and liaison officers from multiple agencies. Any one of them could have leaked operational details to criminal contacts." Marcus listened to the conversation with growing unease. He had agreed to cooperate with what he thought was a secure federal investigation, but apparently the people trying to kill him had better intelligence about his activities than he did. "So what does that mean for me?" Marcus asked. "If you can't guarantee the security of your own operation, how can you protect me from Morrison's people?" It was a fair question, and Sarah knew that Marcus deserved an honest answer. His safety depended on their ability to identify and neutralize the source of the intelligence leak, but that process could take weeks or months. "We're implementing new security protocols that limit information access to essential personnel only," Sarah said. "And we're going to accelerate the investigation timeline to minimize your exposure to risk." "What kind of acceleration?" Major Hayes leaned forward, his expression serious. "We want you to contact Danny Kowalski and arrange a meeting with his criminal associates as soon as possible. Instead of a gradual intelligence-gathering operation, we're going to move quickly to identify the major players and gather evidence for immediate arrests." The plan was risky, but it offered the advantage of reducing the time Marcus would need to operate as an informant. The longer he remained in the field, the greater the chance that the mole within their organization would provide information that would get him killed. "How quickly are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "Days, not weeks," Sarah replied. "We need you to convince Danny that you have access to valuable information and that you're ready to do business with his contacts immediately." Marcus understood the logic, but he was concerned about his ability to convince experienced criminals that he was legitimate when he had no training in deception and was operating under extreme stress. Amateur mistakes could be fatal when dealing with people like Jake Morrison. "What kind of information am I supposed to have?" Sarah opened a file and slid several documents across the table. "We've prepared a package of intelligence about upcoming boxing matches that appears to be insider information but is actually carefully crafted disinformation. It's valuable enough to attract serious attention but won't compromise any legitimate investigations." Marcus reviewed the documents, noting the professional quality of the fabricated intelligence. Fight schedules, training reports, medical assessments, financial information. Everything was detailed enough to convince gambling operations that they were receiving genuine insider knowledge. "The key is to make Danny and his contacts believe that you have ongoing access to this type of information," Sarah continued. "You're not just selling one-time intelligence. You're offering to become a regular source for their gambling operations." The strategy was sound from an investigative perspective, but Marcus wondered whether he could convincingly portray someone with extensive criminal connections when his actual knowledge of illegal activities was limited to what Sarah had taught him over the past few days. His modified smartphone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Danny Kowalski's number, which created an immediate tactical problem. Marcus was supposed to initiate contact with Danny according to his own timeline, not respond to unexpected calls that might indicate surveillance or manipulation. Sarah gestured for Marcus to answer the call while she activated recording equipment to monitor the conversation. "Marcus, where the hell are you?" Danny's voice carried a note of urgency that suggested he was under pressure. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." "I'm around," Marcus replied cautiously. Had to lay low after that scene at Murphy's. People have been asking questions. Yeah, I heard about that. Look, we need to meet soon. My contacts are getting impatient about the information you promised, and there are opportunities coming up that won't wait. The pressure in Danny's voice suggested that his criminal associates were pushing for immediate results, which could indicate either legitimate business urgency or manipulation designed to force Marcus into a vulnerable situation. What kind of opportunities? Marcus asked. Big fights coming up this weekend. My people need insider information before the betting lines are set. We're talking about serious money, enough to solve your financial problems permanently. Sarah was nodding, indicating that Marcus should agree to the meeting. The accelerated timeline she had discussed was becoming a necessity rather than just a tactical preference. Okay, Marcus said. Where and when? Tonight. Warehouse District, same area where you had the problem yesterday. My contacts want to meet somewhere private where we can discuss business without interruptions. The location immediately raised red flags for Marcus. The Warehouse District was where Jake Morrison's people had tried to capture him, and returning there seemed like an obvious trap. I don't know, Danny. That area's been hot lately. Maybe somewhere more public. Marcus, these people don't do business in public places. It's the warehouse or no deal. And if there's no deal, you're back to unemployment and eviction notices. The ultimatum was designed to pressure Marcus into accepting dangerous conditions, but Sarah was signaling that he should agree. Apparently, the federal team was confident they could provide adequate protection despite the obvious risks. All right, Marcus said. What time and which warehouse? Danny provided specific location details and timing information, then ended the call abruptly. Marcus looked at Sarah.